Zig, zag, zoom! Hi chess kids, PlayfulSquirrel here with another 5 important endgames for you. These are the 5 bishop endgames that every chess kid should know. We're starting off with one which is a very special position in chess and almost a miracle. It's a position where white having an extra piece and a pawn is unable to win. Okay, it's just about the most material you could have without being able to win, the most being 2 knights. But here we've got a bishop and a pawn, and we're actually never able to queen the pawn and win this game for white. Now, why not? The black king is going to set up a final defense on this dark square on h8. And for this pawn to safely become a queen, white's going to have to control that square with either the king or the bishop. However, the bishop, being a bishop, is stuck on one color square for his or her entire life, right? So this bishop is never actually going to be able to control a dark square. And we'll try moving this bishop a lot of times, and you'll see it's never going to get there. The second piece they could try to get there would be the king, and generally the king can't get there because the black king is going to be there, and you're not allowed to run right into the face of the opponent's king. It's illegal. We'll talk about that more in detail too. So first, let's try to use the bishop to get control of this square. Bishop's moving, the black king's just chilling on these squares here. All right, the bishop gives up, and we send in the king. Now, our king needs to get into one of these 3 squares in order to attack h8 with the king. But, you know, if our king came to g7, h7, not allowed, because you can't put your king into check from the opponent's king. So that's illegal. So we just move our king here, side to side. We can't get past. Nobody can take control of this square to chase the opponent's king out. So we bring the pawn up. Here, here, here. One other thing you would often be able to do is sort of chase a king out sideways, you know, make him run that way. But there's no other square to the side right now. So in this position, we've actually created a draw, which you guys may not know about, stalemate. But here, white is covering all the squares the black king could go to, so the king's not allowed to move. But the black king's not in check. There's nobody actually attacking him. So that's stalemate instead of checkmate. And stalemate in chess is not ruled as, oh, well, that means next move you'd have to step there and get eaten. It's ruled as a draw. So white can't win by pushing the king out this way. So we could also push the pawn forward, but then you see this is, again, a stalemate when we get the king trapped here, not in check, everything attacked. So, yeah, you could step away from the pawn now to avoid making the stalemate, but then the king just goes back and forth between these squares. And white can never win. So a draw it is. Our next position, white again only has 1 rook pawn, and this time black has a bishop to defend with. But this is the right bishop for that color square, and most importantly, the black king is not in position to stop the pawn himself here. When the opponent's king is not in good position to stop the pawn, you can often win with 1 extra pawn by trying to trade your bishop for their bishop, or at least distract their bishop from your pawn using your bishop. If they're same colored bishops, of course. Now, what black wants to do is trade this bishop for the pawn, then it would be a draw with white only having this bishop. So we're going to have to make sure to really chase this bishop away before we advance the pawn here. First things first, though, king d6. Excellent move. Getting in the face of this king, and if you haven't, you should have watched one king endgame that every chess kid should know before you watch these more complicated ones with pieces on the board. And you, having watched that, would recognize how we're using our king against the opponent's king. We're blocking him out by taking control of all these squares. That keeps this king from getting anywhere near the fight around this a pawn trying to queen. So black plays king f7. We're going to play a slick move, bishop a4, taking away that square for the king. So now we've built a wall like this. That king is not coming anywhere near black's bishop. It's on its own to try and stop this. So it hangs out here. We push the pawn forward. Now we don't want to push the pawn forward anymore because the bishop will take it. We don't want to bring our king to b8 and then push it because the bishop will gladly sacrifice itself for that pawn and it'll be a draw. We're going to use our bishop to take control of this diagonal here, push that bishop off, and whether it runs away or trades, nobody's going to stop us from getting a queen next move. So this position here, if you can keep their king away, you can very often, with your bishop and king, force this bishop out of the way of a final pass pawn and win with same colored bishops and just 1 extra pawn. Next position illustrates an important factor in bishop endgames. In this one, material is completely equal, meaning we each have 2 pawns, we each have 1 king, we each have 1 bishop. The advantage for white is a positional advantage based on the color of square that these pawns are on. In these same color bishop endings, it's a huge disadvantage to have your pawns on the same color square as your bishop. It not only blocks your bishop in, but it allows your opponent to attack your pawns, which limits your ability to move. Let's say it were black's move here, which luckily for them it is not yet. What could black move? What would you do as black here, right? Can you move this bishop anywhere? Would you feel safe going to e7 and letting white take your b6 pawn? Would you feel safe going to c7 and having white take your g5 pawn? No. Now, is the black bishop ever going to be able to attack white's pawns to make any counterplay, to bother white, to make white defend something? No, because they're on white squares, right? So it's a huge advantage for white that these pawns are stuck there. Other than that, the position's almost equal. White just has a tiny bit extra space. But really, white's going to win this endgame off of the fact that this bishop is attacking the black pawns and this bishop is defending those pawns. All right, so first of all, if this position were black to move, black would be losing because they would be in Zugzwang, forced to move, and every move makes their position worse. If the bishop goes this way, loses a pawn like we said. If it goes this way, loses a pawn like we said. So the other thing to cover is if the king moves, right? If the king steps aside this way, then the white king can go into d5 and c6, which will win this pawn. If the king goes to d6, the white king can come to f5, and that'll allow bishop takes g5, winning this pawn. So the king doesn't want to step out of the way of the white king either. And in fact, if this position were a pure king and pawn ending without these bishops, and it were black's move, they would be losing for the same reason. They would be in Zugzwang, and stepping aside would let the white king in to win, or stepping aside the other way would let the white king in to win. But it's white's move here. White's move with bishops, you can actually win this position for white by using a terrible two-step or triangulation, using 3 moves to get back to the same square. We're going to stay on this diagonal here because it's a short diagonal for this bishop. It only has 2 steps on it. So we're going to play bishop g1. The bishop needs to keep this pawn defended, so he's going to go to c7. Now we're going to go to f2. He comes back, e3. We've achieved the same position we had, but forced our opponent to move because it's their turn. Yeah. Now I'm going to show you how it plays out because it's very instructive. And it's going to show you again how we win with 1 pawn against a bishop that's trying to sacrifice itself for it, okay? So I'm going to have black step aside here. The white king comes in, and the black king's going to go after this pawn here. White's going to take this pawn, and black's going to avoid the bishop trade, because otherwise this pawn would just queen. They need to keep this bishop to try and sacrifice it for this pawn. Now, in this position, white can't keep the black king from eventually coming here and taking this pawn and getting out of the way and starting to queen this pawn. But that's going to take black a few moves. So white can definitely queen first. The question is this black bishop going to be able to sacrifice itself for this pawn when it goes through either g5 or g7? So a very important move here from white is we're going to take control of this long diagonal. So this bishop can't get onto the best diagonal. Now it's going to have real trouble getting to these squares here. Black continues the plan. This pawn starts to queen. Black rushes the bishop here in time to stop it. Now the move g7 for white is a dead draw. Black takes the pawn with the bishop. White recaptures, and black takes this pawn. And then white cannot win with just a bishop. Okay, so that'd be a big mistake. So here what we're going to do is we're going to try and chase this bishop out with our king and bishop again. And here again, you're going to see we're really lucky that we're really skillful. We've made our own luck. We're lucky that this bishop is on a short diagonal because that's going to allow the king and bishop to chase it out quite easily. We take away these 2 squares. The bishop goes anywhere like this. We just queen. Black takes our pawn. And now bishop g5. It may seem brilliant, but if you're an endgame aficionado, you will eventually find moves like this to be just normal endgame moves. We're just taking this bishop off of the square where this pawn would queen. We've taken the last square away from it here, right? We're attacking all 3 of these squares. It can't stay in defense of this pawn. We get a new queen, and white wins. Next position is very similar to that one. Everything's the same except I've added these 2 pawns. And I've done this to illustrate for you the fact that with same colored bishops, or just in general in endgames, you can use a bishop to engineer a pawn breakthrough in an area with equal pawns. First of all, this position is Zugzwang again. If the black king had to move, we would make progress. If the bishop had to move, we would take one of these pawns. I'll show you how, but first we're going to do our terrible two-step little triangulation again. If that looks like magic to you, how we made it black's move when before it was white's move, then you're like a knight. Because knights can't do this. They can't do a terrible two-step. It always takes them 2 moves to get back and forth between 2 places. This bishop just showed his specialty. 1, 2, 3 moves to go to the same place, while this bishop had to do 2. Bishops, kings, and rooks can all do that if they've got the right amount of space, and that's how they can pass the move to another player and take over Zugzwang. So we do this. So now this bishop is going to say, well, are you really threatening to take this? It's defended by a pawn. So we're going to move the bishop here, and we're going to show that white really is threatening to take that pawn because it's a breakthrough that leads to a new queen. So this is partly thanks to white's space advantage that their pawn queens so quickly and this bishop can't get back to defend. But in a lot of situations in bishop endgames, look for chances to break through a pawn structure with a bishop sacrifice. It's again part of the advantage of having their pawn stuck on the same color square as your bishop. Okay, and if you've got no breakthroughs, I'll just mention to you that sometimes you can also win with a move like bishop g3 here. And then you come in here and you can like take this kind of thing. It depends whether you've got room to get out after you go in. All right, our last position, the 5th bishop endgame you need to know, and you don't specifically need to know this position, but this position is going to let me tell you the 5th thing that you need to know about bishop endgames, which is this. With 1 extra pawn, you can often win king and bishop endgames with same colored bishops. If a couple pawns have been traded, it's not completely locked up, so there's some way for the king and bishop to move around. And if you're up a healthy extra pawn, nothing wrong with your position. You've got reasonable place for your king and reasonable amount of space, reasonable pawn structure. You've got very, very good chances of winning any endgame that looks like this. And I'm going to show you a couple variations, not every variation, but a couple variations to make you feel sort of comfortable with that. So we're going to start with c4. We're going to expand our pawn majority here to make a passed pawn, which will distract the opponent from defending the g-pawn, perhaps. Black is getting their bishop active here because the bishop's going to be better behind our pawns than in front of them. So black's just getting the bishop active, and also notice that right away for black, I took like a nice long diagonal, just like in the last game white did. But now the bishop's coming around, and it's got to stop these pawns from queening. And in this position here, I'm going to step aside with the king and let the white king make progress because the variation's more complicated. But if this bishop decided to move because the king didn't want to give way, then you could get a variation like bishop b4, bishop b6. White takes control of a5, which allows this pawn to advance further up the board. And now we just push that pawn further up the board, take a good diagonal with our bishop, and eventually, with this king having to stay near this pawn, our king is going to be able to go win this pawn here eventually. We get near here, lock it down on g5, put our king here. Eventually, you'll play bishop f6 and take on g5. The black king will go eat your a pawn, and then you'll queen this pawn against this bishop, just like we did in the last case, right? With your king and bishop taking this bishop's squares away so it can't sacrifice itself for that pawn. Useful that we learned that in the previous position, right? So now just one variation that's a little bit more complicated. The king comes this way. We bring our king up into good position. Take the long diagonal. Now this king is unable to move. He's kind of in Zugzwang because any move would lose this pawn. And that means this bishop has to step off of one of these diagonals. And again, we're going to take control over the a5 square. So bishop here, we come here. Not afraid of a check. Doesn't really do anything. Our pawn's coming through. The check on f8 doesn't do anything either. And eventually this pawn comes through and white is able to win the game. So those are the 5 same colored bishop endgames you need to know. I hope you enjoyed them. If you did and you'd like to learn more, follow our YouTube channel. There are more great ChessKid videos coming. I am Playful Squirrel, and I wish you a great day. See you next time.